Hi. My name is Jongwoo Kim. I'm from Kitfox Games. And I'm here to talk about subjective simulation design, ludonarrative congruence in the Shrouded Isle. So just to give a quick introduction about our studio, we've been heavily influenced by roguelikes. We're a big fan. So our first title, Shattered Planet, was a roguelite for mobile and PC. Our second title, Moon Hunters, was a procedurally generated myth-building adventure RPG, a whole bunch of things. And then our latest project, Boyfriend Dungeon, is a dating sim crossed with procedural dungeon crawling. So we love dungeon crawling, and we love procedural generation. But the focus of this talk is this weird game called The Shrouded Isle. Let me give you a quick look at our Switch version's trailer. As you saw from the trailer, the Shrouded Isle is a human sacrifice cult simulator. You lead this small town that is randomly generated at the start of each playthrough in its last 5 years of its existence, because they believe in that the dark god Chernobog will awaken and save the world. So you maintain the loyalty of the 5 great houses of the village, as well as maintain the faith of your people. And you make a seasonal human sacrifice in Chernobog's name. So the project began as a prototype for Ludonarrative back in August 2015, and we really loved the concept, so we decided to fully expand it to a commercial release. And last August, so August 2017, we made the full version of the Shrouded Isle for PC and OS X. And then the reception was great, so we released a free expansion pack in November called Sunken Sins. And finally, we're moving towards releasing the Switch version later this year or early 2019. To get to the main topic of this talk, why subjective simulation design, and what does that have to do with the Shrouded Isle? Well, it has to do with the theme of the game jam. It was, you are the monster. And instead of looking at it in terms of what is a physical monster, we thought the more interesting angle was, why does someone make monstrous choices? So in a sense, we wanted to explore why the leader of a community would take actions that clearly harm members of that community. And we wanted to do that in terms of maintaining ludonarrative congruence. We wanted to tell the narrative through the gameplay, as opposed to the much more common occurrence of ludonarrative dissonance, where the narrative is undermined or completely orthogonal to the gameplay. The challenge in trying to do this was that we had to depict the cult's subjective reality. This cult believes in values that might not be something that you or I believe in. And what we found was that most of the references for simulation design were very much about objective realities and therefore undermine the narrative. So to give a couple of examples, we wanted to depict a spiritualist worldview in the game. This is a world where the people firmly believe that a dark god exists and he will come back to judge the world. But most simulation games are materialist, focusing on physical resources and how to manipulate those resources. We wanted to explore the culture on this island where Like, what is considered a virtue? What is considered a vice in this community? But what we found were examples of questions about industry. How do you maximize the economic value of something? Finally, and most importantly, we wanted to be able to depict through gameplay moral decay in this community. We wanted to show a leadership that is trying desperately to maintain control over the populace at any cost. But most of the examples we found had a message of economic growth, depicting a community that is growing to prosper or moving towards its zenith. So to go back to the main question of why subjective simulation design, because it allows us to systemically depict psychological realities. And we can do so while maintaining ludonarrative congruence. We can tell the narrative through the gameplay. And I find that this is a much more impactful way of telling the narrative than simply having scripted content or a wall of text, as Jim's previous presentation was clearly arguing against, because the player is an active participant in the decisions and therefore is personally responsible for the outcomes. Of course, from a development standpoint, this is really, really challenging because we have to find alternative gameplay elements to replace the aspects of objective simulation design that we don't want to keep. So this talk is going to look at 3 ways in which the Shrouded Isle found the subjective gameplay elements that replaced objective gameplay elements. So for resources, we replaced physical resources with psychological ones. In terms of core mechanics, we replaced all process-oriented mechanics with character-oriented mechanics. Finally, in terms of progression, we replaced expansion spatially or like a technological upgrades with progression through information. So starting with psychological resources, here's a screenshot from just after the Game Jam version of the project. You'll see at the bottom left that we had physical resources at the time. So the player could grow food, build shelter, and this worked well enough for like creating a survival situation. But the problem was that having a like fully stocked food bar, which you could do, it seemed like it had a message of prosperity. And furthermore, it didn't feel as though a cult leader should be directly managing these values anyway. So instead, we moved towards having psychological resources so that we could focus on what a cult leader would care about, faith and politics. So at the bottom row there, you see the religious values of the town, of ignorance, of fervor, discipline, penitence, and obedience. And these are raised or decreased by the actions of the townspeople. If people act virtuously, these values will go up, and if they act sinfully, they go down. And you'll notice the notches in each of the bars. That's the threshold at which the people will start to lose their faith. And if it stays below that threshold for too long, the game ends. In terms of political values, we have the house opinion. So you have, on the far left, you see the Kegney family is satisfied with the player's rule, but the Yosefka family, which is right next to them, only feel neutral. And the way these work depends on how much favor you show to a given family. So if you keep employing members of the Kegney family as your primary advisors, they'll be very happy, but everyone else will be somewhat unhappy. And another factor is whether you kill members of their family as a sacrifice or not. So what's really important about these psychological resources is that they make the player embrace the cult's values implicitly. Even if the player initially does not want to promote ignorance out of personal values, in order to succeed at this game or even survive at this game, they need to accept that the town's ignorance needs to be maintained. And furthermore, because these are psychological values, they are divorced from objective reality or survival. And as a result, the player's interests are completely dissociated from the villager's interests. And this creates scenarios in which the player will willingly make Machiavellian decisions. There's a further benefit in that it keeps the game's economy in a state of volatile stagnation. And I believe this is a good alternative to having mechanics that have sustained economic growth. So what I mean is that the overall size of the economy is somewhat stagnant, but individual resources can fluctuate greatly. And as a result, you can create dynamic cascading crises. So here's an example. I'm going to select Chessa on the far left there in the Kegni family as my lead advisor this season. You'll notice that because she's a member of the Kegni family, she'll be burning books and therefore raise ignorance. But she's also personally a sadist, so by having her in a leadership position, she will raise fervor of the town. But she's also rebellious, and therefore her example will be a negative one, and therefore reduce the town's obedience to critical values. In terms of politics, House Kegni will be very happy that you chose one of their daughters as the lead advisor this season, but everyone else will be slightly unhappy, and in fact, in the Efferson's case, it will be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and they will start to plot against you. As you can see with the interconnectedness of the resources, a simple choice was given like a complex nuance, and this is because the values themselves were highly volatile. But at the same time, because the overall economic size is the same, it doesn't spiral up or down. And as far as like being able to do this in terms of physical resources over psychological resources, we could have done it with food, shelter, or whatever. But it's much easier to justify like Chessa being overly fervorous and therefore being somewhat disobedient compared to growing food somehow having an effect on shelter. Another game that does psychological resources in a really clever way is Reigns. So at the top there, you have the 4 icons, and they both simultaneously represent the physical value of a given resource, along with the approximate political influence that the faction has. So the sword is simultaneously the army's strength, as well as how much the army influences the country. And that allows them to have punishments for both maxing out or bottoming out. If you're bottomed out, then you don't have enough troops to defend your country. If you're maxed out, then the general will raise a coup d'etat against you and take over the country. But because their economy is much more fragile than the Shrouded Isles, I find that there's many cases of sudden death that is difficult to prevent without memorizing the impact of the cards, essentially. For what it's worth, that's perfectly fine for Reigns because they completely embrace the whimsical nature of their death system and have a meta progression actually built around your kings dying over time. Moving on to the core mechanics, I find that most simulation games tend to have process-oriented mechanics. And what I mean is that they're largely abstracted industrial processes. Even games where you assign workers or assign characters to do something, the primary difference is in how fast or how much they are gathering the resource. And early on in the Shrouded Isles development, our mechanics were exactly the same. We gave orders at the house level, telling House Kegni, like House Efferson and so forth, to build shelters, and the results were calculated in aggregate because it really didn't matter how they were gathering resources. But this felt dissatisfying because, similar to what was happening with the psychological versus physical resources, it didn't seem like what a cult leader would really care about. And what we really wanted to look at is what are the behaviors of the townspeople? Like, are they behaving virtuously or sinfully? Like, we needed a reason for the player to want to sacrifice someone at the end of the season. So we moved towards having character-oriented mechanics instead. And the goal was essentially this. We wanted to humanize resource management by having unpredictable characters. And to do so, all actions involve characters in some way. You either tell someone to do something or you do something to somebody. And it's important that even though the player can order characters, they can't directly control them or control the outcomes. So to give you an example of what happens, here's Chessa again, and this is a different playthrough, so I don't know her very well anymore, but I really need someone from the Kegni family because their responsibility, as you can see at the top, is ignorance. And I believe that Chessa is going to be a successful advisor because, well, I can see from the rumors that she's full of fervor and somewhat disobedient, and I'm just going to assume that that's going to be okay. So the season begins, and I decide to select Chessa as my only advisor, or my only lead advisor, and you can see from the prediction bar at the bottom that the ignorance is going to go up somewhat, which is great, and the Kegni family are very happy about it, which is fine. And on the bottom right, because we don't know what Chessa's vice is exactly, the prediction doesn't show anything about what will happen to obedience, but we can assume it'll go down some amount. But I'm going to hope that it's going to be very little. Unfortunately, Chessa screws up badly, and instead of actually raising ignorance, she reduces ignorance. And furthermore, her vice turns out to be severe and completely drains the town's obedience. As you saw in the example, because I was engaged at every step of appointing Chessa and telling Chessa to do something, I had an implicit trust towards her ability to actually do it. And because I had a mismatched expectation, her failure creates a sense of betrayal. Whereas if this were entirely a process, then I'd only have myself to blame for creating a chain of events that caused this bad outcome. And what this does is it creates narrative context to what would otherwise be a really banal resource acquisition action. Probably the most complex and most successful example of character-oriented gameplay, a game that has character-oriented gameplay, is Crusader Kings 2. As you play only the head of a dynasty as opposed to controlling the entire country directly, you have to maintain the loyalty of your vassals because you can't go to an army if your you can't go to war without an army, and your vassals won't supply you with an army if they don't like you. And as for having your dynasty survive, you need heirs, and your heirs need to be in advantageous marriages, and that won't be that depends entirely on your ability to negotiate with rival kingdoms and rival duchies. And when your leader dies, a lot of these relations were personally tied to them and not to the state itself. So your heir might not have the loyalty of the vassals or the alliances that you took so much effort to build up. And while all of this is really ultimately backed up by relatively straightforward military gameplay, a lot of the richness of Crusader Kings 2 comes from its character-oriented mechanics. Moving on to progression systems, we considered having a more conventional approach to it. So having spatial expansion as like a wide form of progression, or tech upgrades as a tall form of progression. But what we found was that it was rather incompatible with the narrative because the island is isolated and has a dwindling population. So we chose to go with progression through information gathering instead. So here's how it works. At the start of the playthrough, you don't know very much about the townspeople or their traits. So Bogdan here is completely unknown to us. But at the start of each season and during the work phase, we're able to inquire about the character's traits. So if I inquire about Bogdan's virtue, we can reveal that he is rumored to be obedient. So that's partial information. And if we do it again, we are able to fully reveal it and see that he affects obedience by 5 points because he is a timid person. What this allows us to do is give subjective rewards. The characters themselves don't change at all. No matter how much you know about them, they're still going to change affect the town in the same way. But the change happens in the player's perception. Because you have more information, you're able to better plan, and therefore you're effectively more intelligent in assessing the impact of using a character. There's a further change in the villager's perception in that if you're able to reveal that someone is highly virtuous or highly sinful, you get greater bonuses in the sacrifice phase. So let's go back to Chessa for a second. So you might recall that she really screwed up. She couldn't burn books, and that her vice turned out to be severe. So we're going to follow up with her and see how disobedient she is. And it turns out that she is rebellious. She is a major sinner. So during the sacrifice phase, we have to pick one of the 5 advisors that we selected earlier to be the seasonal sacrifice. And I'm going to select Chessa because I want to make an example of her. So we can see that House Kegney are obviously unhappy about it, but they will grudgingly accept the decision because I fully revealed that she is a rebellious person. Furthermore, you can see at the bottom right there that the obedience bar is restored because we're making an example of her rebelliousness and therefore tell the villagers to be more obedient. And so justice is served and the town learns a lesson. sum up the benefits of progression by information, it allows good intentions to go wrong. So even though I had fairly good reasons for choosing Chessa as my main advisor, things didn't go the way I planned, and of course, I could have been more careful about it, but I had relatively good reasons for choosing Chessa because I needed obedience. And because the information is so critical, it encourages players to get to know the characters, which supports the character-oriented mechanics that I mentioned previously. In terms of strategic gameplay, it actually rewards having hidden information rewards prudence and foresight, because if skilled players can make reasonable assumptions, they can learn over time to rely on less and less information to make a decision. So to sum this up, subjective simulation design allows us to depict psychological realities through ludonarrative congruence. We're able to tell the narrative through the mechanics without compromise. The 3 ways that the Shrouded Isle managed to do this are the following. First, we use psychological resources to encourage players to embrace alternative paradigms. Even if you don't personally agree that ignorance should be of value, in context of leading this town, you're going to have to, and therefore you are likely to take decisions that a dictator might. Character-oriented mechanics allowed us to humanize resource management. We were able to tell powerful narratives of betrayal and mismatched expectations because a character was involved in every step and the player was personally involved in every step. Finally, progression through information allows players to improve over time without direct empowerment. As opposed to having a tech tree or allowing the player to expand the town, the player becomes effectively more intelligent over time because they're able to make better decisions and therefore have better trade-offs. So that's it for the presentation. Thank you very much. And we have a few minutes for questions, I think.
Yeah, if you want to take some questions.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, over there.
Hey,
Hey.
Good job.
Oh, thanks.
Let me ask you, do you feel like these same mechanics, the same number mechanics could work if the setting was not this, if it was like an amusement park, and then some people had to be promoted to like head clown and leave the island? Like if there was a more positive thing without the death and gravitas, do you think you could do the same work?
Right.
I mean it.
That's a great question. So when we shipped the Shrouded Isle, a lot of people felt like a lot of people associated the game as being a message for whatever organization that they were not happy with at the time. And so in that regard, as long as I don't think the game needs to be as violent as it is to be successful. What it does need to be is have psychological resources at the core that represent the thought process that you want to replicate.
So, first of all, that was a fabulous presentation.
Thank you.
You mentioned that having unpredictable outcomes for player actions can lead to a sense of betrayal,
Yep.
and then showed how you made that a pleasant and rewarding experience for the player. What design decisions did you make so that that sense of betrayal was fun for the player rather than just frustrating and unpleasant?
Right. I think a lot of it is the consistency of the mechanics below, like at the hidden information layer. So if it was completely random and opaque, then it is frustration without a purpose. But as long as the player has some means of gaining more information, like as in the inquiry system, so if someone screws up like Chessa did, you're able to immediately follow up and reveal that, oh, it's because of this. And further, you're able to know how many major sinners are in the village through other mechanics, for instance. So being able to have some amount of foresight is critical. For what it's worth, I do see that as kind of a gray area, and it's more of a balancing question for how much information you present the player. I guess like the Shrouded Isle as is didn't ship with difficulty modes, but if I were to have something like that to like lower the frustration, I would seed more like revealed information at the start of the playthrough.
Okay. Does that sense of betrayal ever lead the player to make a decision that's a bad decision in the game? Like, I'm so pissed at that character for betraying me, I'm going to kill them, but maybe that was like a bad decision?
Yeah, That's an interesting question because what I noticed during playtest is that early on the players will kind of try to play by their own morality, but eventually, like after the first season or so, they kind of adopt this inner tyrant mindset, and so I guess what I'm trying to get at with that is so definitely some players act emotionally, like at least like in the first couple turns of the game, and that is not the optimal choice. But eventually, as the player understands how the values work, or like what is being rewarded versus what is being punished, they tend to act appropriately to these acts of betrayal. Oh. Okay.
It's okay. It's okay.
Thank you. So you explicitly referred to not following the traditional simulation elements, right? Which means that you couldn't really inspire yourself from the existing gameplay tunings that you know worked. Do you have any tips or guidance or simply description of how you proceeded to properly balance this particular simulation?
Sorry, is the question specifically about balance or
Yeah.
about, okay.
The process of achieving balance, I guess.
Yeah, that was actually really difficult, and so I talk about it a little bit in the psychological resources section as far as like finding the economic state that I wanted for the game. I think a lot of it comes down to just staying true to what you intend to be the mindset or the paradigm of like the character that you're representing in the game. And so in the case of the Shrouded Isle, growth has nothing to do with it. Sustaining and maybe even like slow decline is what I wanted to express. And therefore, ensuring that the balance, like economic balance comes out to about the even trade-off or slightly worse than even trade-off was what was necessary. And I think that I didn't really refer to any other particular games of balancing sheets for this purpose.
So just repeated trial and error till you got to convergence. Did you use any analytical tools or?
We used analytics during the beta, and that helped us to balance things a little bit. But for the most part, it was very much a trial and error process. And I wish I had a better answer for that, but that's how it was.
Anyone else?
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Great.